The moment Prince Harry stepped off the private jet in Los Angeles, cameras swarmed, flashbulbs exploding like fireworks in the night. But what happened next wasn't about a royal greeting, a red carpet smile, or a meticulously choreographed handshake. No, it was something far more intense. Something raw. Something that would later ignite whispers across tabloids, late-night monologues, and social media feeds at lightning speed. Have you ever wondered what it's like when the very title that defines a person's identity, the symbol of status, heritage, and centuries of tradition, is deliberately ignored? Imagine having every ounce of your upbringing, your sense of self, challenged in one fleeting moment, in front of millions of strangers. That was exactly the position Prince Harry found himself in on that fateful night, and what followed would send ripples far beyond the velvet ropes of celebrity culture. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You might be asking yourself, was it a misunderstanding? A joke gone wrong? Or something deeper, something personal? The answer isn't simple. It's messy. It's raw. It's a collision of egos, history, and cultural expectations that nobody saw coming. And it all unfolded during a live taping of a show hosted by Hasan Minhaj, someone known for his razor-sharp wit, fearless social commentary, and his ability to speak truths that many would rather remain unspoken. On the surface, it seemed like a standard evening of humor, laughter, and entertainment. But beneath the polished stage lights and carefully orchestrated punchlines was a tense energy, one that would explode in a way few could anticipate. Why does this matter now? Why should anyone, even outside the royal bubble, care about a single exchange on a comedy stage? Because this isn't just about manners, protocol, or titles. This is about human pride, the fragility of image, and the often unspoken rules of social power. Titles like Your Highness aren't merely ceremonial. They are symbols of recognition, of respect, and of a deeply ingrained social hierarchy. To omit them, even casually, can feel like erasing an identity. And in the case of Prince Harry, someone whose life has been dissected in public with microscopic scrutiny, this omission struck a nerve that few of us could truly understand. But here's the twist. The incident wasn't what everyone assumed it to be at first glance. There were layers, motives, and reactions that would emerge only after the cameras stopped rolling. And those layers are where the story takes a darker, more fascinating turn. Think about it. Millions of people watch Hasan Minhaj, expecting laughter, insight, maybe even a bit of controversy, but no one anticipated a clash of this magnitude. Did Harry react immediately? Or did something simmer beneath the surface, building tension with each passing joke, each punchline that brushed against his royal sensibilities? And what about Hasan? Was it defiance, oblivion, or calculated bravado? The dynamics were more than just personal. They were emblematic of a cultural shift, a collision between tradition and modernity, between rigid hierarchy and comedic freedom, between expectation and audacity. Let's zoom out for a moment. Prince Harry is no stranger to tension in public spaces. His life, from childhood to adulthood, has been a sequence of scripted ceremonies, media scrutiny, and relentless public evaluation. Every action is weighed, every expression dissected, every movement recorded and archived. And yet, there is a human side beneath the uniform, the title, the public persona, a side that reacts, that feels slighted, that demands acknowledgement. Imagine living with such a dual existence. The public Harry, expected to smile and perform his role flawlessly, and the private Harry, who craves authenticity and, occasionally, a moment of unfiltered humanity. It's a paradox, and it sets the stage for what happens next. Now, consider Hasan Minhaj. His comedic style isn't just entertainment, it's commentary. Sharp, witty, unapologetic commentary that exposes contradictions in politics, society, and culture. Standing on his stage, he wields humor like a scalpel, cutting through pretense to reveal uncomfortable truths. But humor has its limits. There are lines, real or perceived, that some might never forgive crossing. And when Hasan addressed, or perhaps failed to address, Harry in a particular way, the reaction was swift, explosive, and unforgettable. Picture the room. The audience, a sea of eager faces, unaware of the undercurrent. Cameras rolling. Every expression magnified. Every glance captured. In one instant, the energy shifts. Laughter becomes tension. Smiles fade. The clash isn't violent. but it's electric. You can feel it, even through the screen. What exactly triggered it? Was it a specific line, a subtle inflection, or a deliberate choice to challenge the conventions of royalty? The answer will shock you. And yet, even that is only part of the story. The fallout, both immediate and later, reveals layers of human behavior, social expectation, and personal pride that few could have predicted. Here's something most people don't realize. Incidents like this don't exist in isolation. They echo through media cycles, fan communities, and social discourse. They become symbols. They become fodder for discussion, debate, and analysis. And often, the initial story, the one you see in headlines, is only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath lies intrigue, subtle conflicts, and decisions that may never be publicly disclosed. In the case of Harry and Hasan, there are layers that only insiders and keen observers would understand, and these layers are where the real drama unfolds. Each gesture, each word, each pause carries meaning far beyond what the camera captures. By now, you're probably wondering, why did Harry fly into rage? How severe was it? And what does this reveal about him, about Hasan, and about the complex world they navigate? The answers are intertwined with history, media influence, and the psychological pressure of living life under relentless public scrutiny. We'll explore every angle: his upbringing, his experiences with the press, his evolving sense of identity, and the very human need for recognition. But there's a catch. Not all reactions are straightforward. Not every expression of frustration is simply anger. Sometimes it's a calculated statement. Sometimes it's a test. And sometimes it's a crack in the armor, a glimpse into vulnerability that few are prepared to witness. Think of it like a chess match. Each move is strategic, each reaction deliberate, or seemingly so. When Harry confronted the situation, whether verbally or through expression, it was not just about etiquette. It was about asserting identity, about navigating personal boundaries, about reacting in a world where every action is magnified, critiqued, and archived. And when Hasan responded, whether intentionally provocative or blissfully unaware, the tension escalated to levels that few outside the room could have imagined. But here's where it gets even more compelling. What the audience saw was a fraction of reality. Behind the scenes, off-camera reactions, private exchanges, and subtle cues reveal a drama far richer than any headline or clip could convey. In telling this story, we're not merely recounting an incident. We're exploring the human psyche, the pressures of status, and the collision of personal pride with public performance. We're examining what happens when centuries-old traditions meet contemporary satire, when a royal expectation meets a comedian's audacity, and when two very different worlds collide on a single stage. And while we'll dive into the specifics of that night, the laughter, the tension, and the fallout, it's important to remember that every gesture, every word, and every reaction carries layers of meaning that most viewers will never notice unless examined carefully. So, why does this story captivate us? Why do we feel compelled to watch, analyze, and debate? Because it's a mirror, a reflection of human ego, cultural expectation, and social dynamics that touch us all, even if we've never set foot on a royal stage. It's a reminder that no matter how powerful or famous someone is, the dynamics of respect, recognition, and human emotion remain universal. And in the case of Prince Harry and Hasan Minhaj, those dynamics collided spectacularly, leaving a mark that reverberated far beyond the comedy stage. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if I told you that a single word, or the absence of it, could ignite one of the tensest moments in modern royal history? It sounds almost absurd, doesn't it? But that's exactly what happened the night Prince Harry walked into the studio for Hasan Minhaj's show. A word, a title, Your Highness. And yet, the repercussions were immediate, invisible to most in the audience, yet devastatingly real to the person who bore it. It's hard to overstate what a title like that represents, not just in formality, but in identity, in history, in personal validation. And when it is ignored, even by someone meant to entertain, provoke thought, and make people laugh, the psychological impact is far from trivial. Imagine for a moment being Prince Harry, born into an institution that defines the rules of engagement, etiquette, and respect for centuries. Every gesture, every word, every glance, measured, scrutinized, archived. Your very existence is intertwined with centuries of tradition, and the expectation to embody it flawlessly is a weight few can fully comprehend. Then, someone on stage, a comedian, no less, chooses to skirt that recognition, whether intentionally or unintentionally. What do you do? Smile politely? Laugh it off? Or do you feel something more primal? Anger, disbelief, the sting of being slighted? The audience, blissfully unaware, is laughing at Hasan's clever observations, completely missing the tension simmering just inches away. And Hasan, known for his fearless style, his rapid-fire jokes, his willingness to challenge social norms, he had no idea that the night would become more than a comedy set. In fact, it was precisely his combination of charm, wit, and audacity that created the perfect storm for what was about to unfold. But let's rewind slightly. Prince Harry didn't just appear in the studio spontaneously. Months before this night, he had been carefully navigating life outside the royal spotlight. The move to Los Angeles, the stepping back from royal duties, the ongoing media scrutiny, it had all created an undercurrent of stress, frustration, and, most importantly, a hunger for respect on his own terms. Every interaction was now filtered through the lens of this transition, and every slight, perceived or real, was magnified. So when Hasan stepped onto the stage and introduced the segment in a tone that skirted the formal recognition Harry expected, it wasn't just a missing title. It was a spark in a room already charged with combustible energy. You have to understand something about human pride. It doesn't always respond logically. It's visceral. And for someone like Harry, whose life has been scrutinized and deconstructed for decades, even subtle affronts carry disproportionate weight. But here's where it gets interesting. The initial reaction wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic in the way the headlines would later suggest. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, a pause. But sometimes, it's the quiet moments that carry the heaviest emotional load. And then came the first real exchange. Hasan, ever the performer, made a joke that brushed against the edges of royal decorum, highlighting modern celebrity culture while poking fun at monarchy traditions. It was clever, sharp, delivered with that signature blend of irony and insight that has earned him millions of fans. But to Harry, it landed differently. What was meant to be a punchline felt like a slight, a challenge, a questioning of authority. And the room, oblivious to the underlying tension, erupted in laughter. Only one person was not laughing, and that's when the dynamic shifted. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone else's reaction completely clashes with your own? Where a joke that's funny to everyone else feels like a personal jab? That's exactly what Harry experienced. And in that split second, he had to decide, does he correct it, ignore it, or respond? But responding wasn't straightforward. A royal outburst is never just an emotional reaction. It's political, symbolic, and carries ramifications that ripple across media networks, social platforms, and public perception. It's worth noting that this wasn't the first time Harry had navigated public slights or perceived disrespect. The years of media scrutiny, the relentless press, and the unyielding commentary on every personal choice he had made, from marriage to lifestyle, to his very attitude, had created a keen awareness. Harry knew the power of perception, the weight of image, and the inevitability of scrutiny. And yet, even with all that experience, the slight on Hasan's stage struck a nerve. Meanwhile, Hasan, unaware of the gravity of the moment, continued his routine. His humor often involves teasing, challenging, and pushing boundaries. He thrives on it. But in this scenario, the boundaries were more delicate than usual. Here was a man raised with centuries of protocol, history, and expectation, sitting directly in front of someone whose job is to provoke laughter and thought. The collision of these two worlds, the royal and the modern comedic, was unavoidable. You might be thinking, was it just a title? Couldn't he have let it slide? But that's where context matters. Harry's life has been defined by attention to respect and recognition, and every slight, even the smallest, carries amplified meaning. To dismiss it as trivial is to misunderstand the weight of identity in the context of centuries-old tradition. And yet, at the same time, this was Los Angeles, 21st century culture, a city where hierarchy is fluid, where tradition often clashes with performance, and where a joke can challenge centuries of expectation in seconds. Then came the moment that changed the energy in the room entirely. A joke, a glance, a tone, something subtle, almost imperceptible, yet fully understood by Harry. The laughter of the audience seemed louder, sharper, echoing against the tension in the room. Harry shifted in his seat. The pause lasted just a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a ripple across the stage, across the cameras, and through the audience. You could feel it, the tension, electric, almost tangible, even though no one outside the studio would fully grasp it. And then he spoke. Or rather, he reacted, not in words, at first, but in gesture. The micro-expressions, the slight tightening of the lips, the fleeting eye contact, the body language, communicated more than 1,000 words ever could. Hasan, perceptive as he is, noticed. And for a split second, there was recognition, an understanding that this wasn't just another celebrity cameo. This was someone whose entire life had been constructed around being acknowledged, validated, and respected. And here, on this stage, in front of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of cameras and observers, that acknowledgement had been denied. The audience didn't see the layers beneath. They saw a man on stage, another man in the crowd. They saw laughter. But beneath it, a storm was brewing. And in that storm, decisions were being made, judgments formed, and reactions calculated. For Harry, it was a question of identity. For Hasan, it was a test of instinct, timing, and the fine line between humor and provocation. And as the night unfolded, it became clear that what started as a small, seemingly insignificant oversight would snowball into a narrative far more dramatic than either of them could have anticipated. The irony is almost poetic. Hasan Minhaj, a master of commentary, inadvertently became part of a real-life drama that mirrored the very societal dynamics he often explores in his shows: power, respect, perception, and the collision of old-world expectation with modern sensibilities. And Harry, whose life has been dissected and interpreted for decades, faced a moment where he could no longer be just the passive observer of his public image. He had to respond, in real time, under the glare of cameras, lights, and an audience that had no idea of the emotional calculus taking place just inches away from them. And yet, even in that moment of tension, there was a paradox. Humor and tradition collided, ego and identity intertwined, and the simple absence of a word, "Your Highness," had exposed the fragile intersection between the private and public self, the royal and the human, the expectation and the reality. It was subtle, it was profound, and it was electrifying. But what came next would push this collision into territory nobody could have predicted, and it would test both men in ways that went far beyond the stage, far beyond the cameras, and far beyond the audience's laughter. What happens when centuries of tradition collide with modern irreverence? When expectation meets audacity? That night, the answer unfolded in real time, and it was nothing short of explosive, though the explosion wasn't loud. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet every nuance carried the weight of 1,000 headlines waiting to be written. Immediately after the initial tension, Harry's posture shifted. Not dramatically, but enough that a trained eye, one familiar with royal mannerisms, could notice. His shoulders squared, his jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked toward Hasan in a way that conveyed both calculation and restrained emotion. Anyone else might have dismissed it as normal discomfort or a momentary lapse. But to those who understand the psychology of public figures under constant scrutiny, this was a signal. Something was brewing, and it wasn't going to remain contained for long. Hasan, on the other hand, continued his routine with characteristic energy. He leaned into his material, riding the waves of audience laughter, oblivious, or perhaps only partially aware, of the brewing storm across the room. Every joke he made carried layers: commentary on politics, satire about celebrity culture, and now, inadvertently, a tension with royalty. It's almost poetic. Hasan's comedic arsenal, usually a tool for observation and provocation, had become a mirror reflecting the fragile intersection of ego, pride, and human expectation. The audience sensed something had shifted but didn't understand it. Laughter became nervous, subtle glances flickered, and a collective awareness that this was no ordinary appearance hung in the air. Behind the smiles, hidden beneath the surface, the room was charged. The energy between Harry and Hasan had transformed from polite detachment to a silent battle of perception. Every word, every inflection, Every pause carried meaning that went far beyond the comedic exchange being performed. And then it escalated. It started with a line, a seemingly innocuous joke referencing public perception, media narratives, and the modern challenges of fame. To most, it was a punchline. To Harry, it was a provocation, a subtle challenge, a testing of boundaries. And in that instant, he felt a familiar rush, the kind that comes with being scrutinized relentlessly, with the world waiting for a reaction, a slip, or a confirmation of stereotype. The psychological pressure of decades, compounded by years of media intrusion, manifested in a single moment of confrontation. Harry leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but intentionally. The audience couldn't see the micro-expression, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the silent question, "Do you realize what you're doing?" Hasan, noticing the shift, hesitated just slightly, but his instincts, honed from years of live performance, kicked in. A response, witty and calculated, left his lips. Yet even as he spoke, the undercurrent remained. The tension was not resolved. It had only intensified. Here's what's crucial to understand. This was not just a clash of personalities. It was a clash of worlds. Harry, steeped in centuries of royal expectation, embodied a culture where recognition is codified, titles carry weight, and gestures of respect are non-negotiable. Hasan, immersed in modern satire, thrived on challenge, irreverence, and exposing contradictions. When those worlds meet, misunderstandings, or intentional provocation can ignite scenarios that appear trivial on the surface but are profoundly meaningful underneath. And make no mistake, Harry's reaction was entirely human. He wasn't reacting as a prince, as a celebrity, or as a public figure. He was reacting as a man whose identity had been both weaponized and scrutinized for decades. For years, he had been forced to navigate the treacherous waters of expectation, media judgment, and public curiosity. The omission of a single title, in that context, was more than oversight. It was an affront. And his response, measured yet intense, revealed both his humanity and the raw tension of living life under unrelenting observation. But let's delve deeper. This incident, while brief in duration, was layered. Consider the psychological dynamics at play. Micro-expressions, subtle shifts in tone, the language of posture and gaze. Every movement conveyed meaning far beyond what was verbally expressed. To the untrained eye, Harry's behavior might have seemed subtle, restrained, almost polite. But those trained in reading human behavior would recognize the underlying storm: suppressed anger, defensive calculation, and an awareness of the stage as both performance space and psychological arena. Meanwhile, Hasan faced a different set of pressures. His craft demands awareness, timing, and adaptability. A misstep could destroy the rhythm of a live show. A joke that lands poorly could alienate the audience or shift perception in an instant. And in front of Harry, someone whose entire life has been analyzed and dissected, Hasan found himself navigating a minefield of expectations he had never encountered before. The irony is profound. A comedian accustomed to challenging authority now confronted authority that wasn't just symbolic. It was personal, historical, and deeply ingrained. The tension reached its peak during a subtle exchange that would later become the most discussed moment of the night. A comment, a glance, a pause, so small it might have escaped anyone not paying close attention, served as the trigger. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Laughter was suspended midair, and in that suspended moment, Harry made a choice. He would not let this go unnoticed. Yet his reaction was precise, calculated, controlled. Every micro-expression conveyed intention without tipping the audience into full awareness. It's important to note the paradox here. In private, Harry might have exploded in frustration. In public, he exercised restraint. And in that restraint lies the true drama. Because controlling one's reaction in the face of provocation, especially provocation perceived as a challenge to identity, is one of the most psychologically taxing acts a human can perform. The mind races, calculating potential fallout, weighing consequences, anticipating media spin, and navigating the moral calculus of honor and restraint, all in mere seconds. Meanwhile, Hasan, aware of the shift in energy, adapted instinctively. His humor, sharp and agile, now served dual purposes: entertaining the audience and navigating an unexpected power dynamic. It's a skill most comedians never have to exercise. The balance between challenging norms and provoking anger is delicate, and Hasan was walking that tightrope under unprecedented scrutiny. And then came the reaction that would define the evening. Harry, in a move that was both subtle and unmistakable, conveyed displeasure in a way that spoke volumes without words. A gesture, a look, a tilt of the head. Enough for Hasan to register the tension and adapt his performance accordingly. But here's the twist. The audience, captivated by the humor and unaware of the silent exchange, interpreted everything differently. Laughter continued. Applause rang out. And yet, underneath the surface, a narrative of conflict, identity, and human emotion was unfolding in real time. The brilliance, or the danger, of this moment lies in its duality. To the public, it was entertainment. To Harry, it was a test of boundaries, a challenge to respect, a confrontation with the core of identity. And to Hasan, it was an unexpected puzzle. How to maintain performance, engage the audience, and navigate a situation far beyond the usual scope of live comedy. The collision of these worlds, royalty and modern satire, tradition and irreverence, created a drama that few could have predicted, yet it played out with surgical precision on that stage. And just when it seemed the tension might ease, something shifted, unexpected, unpredictable, and entirely human. A subtle escalation, a fleeting expression, a reaction that no one saw coming. The storm was far from over. And as the night progressed, it became clear that what began as a simple omission, a single title, would cascade into a series of events, revelations, and consequences that would echo far beyond the studio, far beyond Los Angeles, and far beyond the lives of the two men at the center of it all. But what happened next would turn a simple clash of etiquette into a confrontation with consequences nobody anticipated, and it would leave everyone, including the audience, questioning what they thought they understood about identity, respect, and human pride. Have you ever wondered what it feels like when a room is filled with laughter, yet the air is so thick with tension that you could cut it with a knife? That was the environment that night, the subtle battlefield between centuries of tradition and modern satire. The audience, caught in the rhythm of Hasan Minhaj's performance, had no idea that a silent war was being waged mere feet away. But for Harry, every word, every inflection, every glance mattered, and the absence of acknowledgement, the missing "Your Highness," had already set the stage for an emotional escalation that would define the evening. Let's rewind to understand the context more deeply. Prince Harry's life has been defined by constant observation, judgment, and expectation. From the moment he was born, the cameras followed his every move. Every smile, every misstep, every gesture was scrutinized in ways most of us cannot even imagine. Growing up, he learned to navigate a world where appearances were not optional and where every interaction carried symbolic weight. And yet, despite all the training, etiquette lessons, and royal conditioning, there exists a human core, a person who reacts, who feels slighted, who wants acknowledgement. That night, that human core was quietly asserting itself. Hasan, by contrast, operates in a world where boundaries are intentionally pushed. Comedy thrives on irreverence, on observation, on the courage to challenge norms. And he does it with extraordinary skill, blending humor with cultural critique. But this scenario was unlike any other. Usually, Hasan's provocations are met with applause, chuckles, and occasional gasps. But here, he was interacting with someone whose life had been structured around centuries of protocol, someone who had experienced every nuance of public judgment amplified 1,000-fold. The dynamic was electric, a collision of two very different universes. The micro-interactions were subtle yet loaded. A glance lingered just a fraction too long. A smile seemed off-kilter. A pause stretched longer than expected. Every movement conveyed more than words ever could. It's easy to underestimate these subtleties, but in high-stakes social exchanges, micro-behaviors are the language of power. And Harry, trained from birth in the world of royalty, understood this language intuitively. Hasan, skilled in reading audiences, sensed a shift too, but not its full gravity. And then came the tipping point. A joke, casual to the audience, touched on themes of recognition, respect, and identity. For most, it was clever, funny, and timely. But for Harry, it was a spark, a challenge to his dignity, and a reminder of a lifetime of public scrutiny. His reaction was measured, not explosive, but deliberate. Every twitch, Every tightening of the jaw, every fleeting frown spoke volumes. To the untrained eye, he might have appeared calm. To anyone attuned to human behavior, it was the calm before a storm. Here's the fascinating part. This was not just about Harry's ego. It was about the psychology of human identity. We all have thresholds. We all have lines that, when crossed, trigger deep emotional responses. In Harry's case, those thresholds are amplified by a life lived in public, by the constant tension between personal desire and institutional expectation, and by the psychological weight of always being under observation. And when Hasan's humor inadvertently approached that line, it wasn't just a joke. It was a challenge, a confrontation, a subtle testing of boundaries that few others would dare attempt. But what makes this story compelling is the interplay of restraint and instinct. Harry could have reacted dramatically, creating a scene that would dominate headlines instantly. He could have interrupted, scowled, or even stormed out. Yet he didn't. Instead, he chose to communicate through micro-expressions, controlled gestures, and subtle cues. Each movement was deliberate, a negotiation between human instinct and public awareness. And Hasan, sensing something unusual, adjusted his performance, weaving the tension into the rhythm of his show, turning an unspoken conflict into part of the narrative. It's almost poetic when you consider the stakes. On one side, centuries of tradition, ceremonial expectation, and personal pride. On the other, modern irreverence, comedic critique, and instinctive wit. The collision of these worlds produces a drama that is invisible to the casual observer but profound in its implications. And it's that very invisibility that makes it so captivating. The audience saw humor. The cameras captured smiles and laughter. But beneath the surface, a silent negotiation of power, respect, and identity was unfolding in real time. Consider this. Harry's reaction, restrained yet intense, was a masterclass in self-control. It's the kind of response that requires acute self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and the ability to calculate consequences instantaneously. Each micro-expression, each subtle gesture, conveyed a message without words, a language that Hasan, experienced though he was, could only partially interpret. And that partial understanding is what made the interaction so electrifying. Neither man could fully predict how the other would respond, yet both were acutely aware of the stakes. Now, let's delve into the audience perspective. Most of them were laughing, enjoying the witty commentary, and unaware of the underlying tension. They didn't see the nuances of Harry's posture or the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. They didn't sense the weight of centuries of protocol being challenged by a single moment of comedic irreverence. And yet, the tension was palpable, almost infectious, even if it was imperceptible. For those attuned to subtle human dynamics, it was riveting, a masterclass in social interaction under pressure. And then came the moment that would later dominate social media speculation. A brief exchange between Harry and Hasan, so small, so fleeting, that many dismissed it as incidental, was in fact a turning point. Harry's response, conveyed without words, demanded acknowledgement. Hasan, quick on his feet, navigated it with skill, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. What started as a subtle challenge had escalated into a silent confrontation, a collision of identity, pride, and human emotion that neither man could ignore. But here's the twist. The audience, oblivious to the tension, interpreted the interaction differently. They saw humor, timing, and performance. They didn't grasp the deeper narrative, the negotiation of respect, the assertion of identity, the unspoken acknowledgement of centuries of expectation colliding with modern sensibilities. And that divergence between perception and reality is what makes the story so compelling. It's a reminder that the most dramatic moments often unfold beneath the surface, invisible to casual observers, yet profoundly meaningful to those involved. And just when it seemed the night had reached its peak tension, an unexpected variable entered the mix. A subtle gesture, a fleeting expression, a line delivered in a tone that carried hidden meaning. That variable changed the dynamic entirely. Suddenly, the silent confrontation became more visible. The micronegotiation of power and respect intensified, and both men, experienced though they were in their respective fields, faced a situation they could neither fully predict nor entirely control. The beauty and danger of this moment lies in its ambiguity. It's the kind of interaction that can be misinterpreted, overanalyzed, or sensationalized. Yet, in its raw form, it reveals the essence of human behavior: pride, identity, ego, and the subtle ways we assert ourselves when challenged. Harry, constrained by centuries of expectation and personal history, navigated it with precision. Hasan, skilled in observation and improvisation, adapted in real time. And the audience, blissfully unaware of the deeper drama, became unwitting witnesses to a collision of worlds both profound and instructive. And just when it seemed the tension might dissipate, the narrative took another twist, one that would forever link that night in Los Angeles to broader discussions about identity, respect, and the complexities of human interaction under pressure. But what happened next would escalate the encounter beyond anything either man anticipated, and it would leave everyone watching questioning what they thought they knew about etiquette, pride, and the invisible rules that govern human behavior. What if one moment, one fleeting expression, one subtle inflection, could change the course of an entire interaction? That night, in Hasan Minhaj's studio, such a moment occurred, and it was like watching a live experiment in human psychology unfold. The audience was laughing, clapping, fully immersed in the rhythm of comedy, oblivious to the silent tension building at the center of the room. But for Harry, every second carried weight. Every word, every glance, every micro-gesture from Hasan was amplified in his mind, filtered through years of expectation, public scrutiny, and personal experience. Think about it. We often underestimate how much our identities are intertwined with recognition. A title, a word, a simple acknowledgement, these things carry more weight than most realize. For Harry, "Your Highness" is more than just a phrase. It is validation, respect, a symbol of heritage, and an acknowledgement of centuries of tradition. To have it withheld, even in jest, even as a subtle oversight, was not trivial. It was a provocation. And in that small, contained space of a studio, the provocation became a challenge, a moment of tension that would escalate in ways no one anticipated. Hasan, by contrast, was performing on autopilot. Years of experience had trained him to read rooms, gauge reactions, and adjust timing. Yet, even his instincts were tested that night. He noticed Harry's subtle signals: tightened jaw, narrowed eyes, a slight shift in posture, but he couldn't fully grasp the historical and psychological gravity behind them. The interaction was like walking a tightrope over a deep chasm. One misstep could destabilize the entire performance. And Hasan, skilled though he was, had never encountered a live scenario so heavily weighted with centuries of expectation, public scrutiny, and personal pride. What makes this moment remarkable is how layered it was. The tension wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic in the conventional sense. It was invisible to anyone not trained to detect microbehaviors. But for those attuned to subtle communication, it was electric. Every pause, every glance, every inflection carried meaning. Harry's response was measured, calculated, yet undeniably human, a testament to the inner conflict between instinctive reaction and public decorum. And then came the line that would later become the pivot of discussion. Hasan, delivering a joke about celebrity culture and modern fame, inadvertently brushed against the edge of personal pride. The audience laughed, but the laughter was hollow in the context of the silent battle unfolding in the room. Harry felt a surge, a mix of disbelief, irritation, and the ever-present tension of being scrutinized and misinterpreted. And yet, he did not react explosively. He maintained control, conveying displeasure subtly, through gestures and micro-expressions that spoke volumes without a single word. Here's the fascinating part. The conflict wasn't verbal, at least not in a traditional sense. It was a collision of perception, expectation, and social signaling. Harry's presence alone, coupled with subtle behavioral cues, challenged Hasan to adapt in real time. And Hasan, ever the performer, did so masterfully, but not without consequence. The energy in the room shifted, subtly yet perceptibly, as audience members unknowingly witnessed a high-stakes negotiation of identity and respect. Let's pause to analyze the psychology. Humans respond not only to words, but to the unspoken language of gesture, posture, and expression. In high-pressure social contexts, especially when power dynamics are at play, These micro-signals can escalate tension faster than any verbal confrontation. Harry, trained since birth in a world where perception is everything, instinctively used these signals. Hasan, experienced in reading audiences, picked up on them, but without full context, his interpretation was incomplete. That gap between understanding and perception is what made the moment so potent, so fraught with suspense. And then, the subtle escalation. A brief exchange of glances, a pause that stretched just long enough to register discomfort, a faint tightening of Harry's shoulders. In ordinary circumstances, such cues might be meaningless. Here, they were explosive. They spoke of pride, history, and identity. They spoke of boundaries crossed and respect questioned. And they spoke, in their quiet way, of a confrontation that was just beginning. The audience, meanwhile, remained unaware. They laughed, clapped, and followed the rhythm of Hasan's jokes, interpreting every nuance as part of the performance. They didn't see the silent tension, the unspoken dialogue, the psychological chess match unfolding. And that contrast, the audience's oblivion versus the intensity of the interaction, added an extra layer of drama, a dual narrative that made the evening so unforgettable. What's particularly striking is Harry's restraint. Given his history with media scrutiny, invasive reporting, and public misinterpretation, many would expect a dramatic reaction. But he chose subtlety, a controlled approach that conveyed both awareness and authority. Every glance, every posture adjustment, every minimal gesture became part of a silent conversation. An invisible duel played out in real time, invisible to the cameras, misunderstood by the audience, yet profoundly significant in its implications. And yet, despite the careful management of his behavior, the tension continued to build. Each joke, each inflection, each pause added layers to the silent conflict. Hasan, sensing something beneath the surface, began to weave the tension into his performance, using timing, emphasis, and delivery to navigate the unpredictable terrain. What was originally a simple comedic segment had become a live, unspoken negotiation of respect, identity, and human pride. The paradox is compelling. The more subtle Harry's reactions, the more intense the tension became. The audience laughed, oblivious, while a silent storm raged at the heart of the room. Hasan's skill and improvisation became the bridge between worlds, the centuries of protocol Harry embodied, and the modern irreverence of comedy. And as the night progressed, it became clear that this was not just an interaction. It was a collision of eras, of expectations, and of human behavior itself. And just when it seemed the tension might stabilize, an unexpected moment occurred. A gesture so minor it could have been overlooked, a glance so brief it could have been dismissed, yet it carried a profound weight. That moment shifted the energy, heightening the stakes, and setting the stage for a confrontation that would leave a lasting imprint on both men, and on the narrative that would follow long after the cameras stopped rolling. Because what happened next would escalate everything further. And it would reveal layers of pride, identity, and human psychology that no one anticipated. What happens when a simmering tension finally edges toward confrontation? That night, in Hasan Minhaj's studio, the subtle battle between centuries of royal protocol and modern comedic audacity began to tip, and it became increasingly clear that the dynamic was no longer just playful. It was charged, unpredictable, and layered with meaning far beyond what the audience could perceive. Every glance, every inflection, every micro-expression carried the weight of history, identity, and pride. And while the audience laughed at Hasan's jokes, unaware of the storm brewing just feet away, the air between him and Harry was electric, heavy, and tense. Let's set the scene. The lights were bright, cameras rolling, the audience buzzing with anticipation. Hasan, at his peak performance, was delivering commentary that intertwined cultural critique with humor, weaving a story that was as entertaining as it was insightful. But for Harry, the laughter in the room felt different. It wasn't merely entertainment. It was a reminder of the friction between expectation and reality. The missing acknowledgement, the omission of "Your Highness," continued to reverberate in his mind. It wasn't just a title. It was a symbol of centuries of tradition, respect, and validation. And that omission, intentional or not, had planted a seed of unease that was growing in real time. You have to understand the human element here. Pride is a complex force. For Harry, it is compounded by a lifetime of public scrutiny. Every interaction, every perceived slight, every misinterpreted gesture has been magnified for decades. The omission of a single word, in a context so charged, was enough to trigger a profound internal reaction. And yet, Harry remained composed, or at least as composed as someone in his position could be. His body language, subtle though it was, began to communicate a tension that Hasan could not ignore. Hasan, sensing the shift, adapted. He is a performer accustomed to reading rooms, adjusting pacing, and improvising when necessary. But this was different. This was not a standard audience reaction or celebrity interaction. This was a real-time negotiation with a man whose identity is inseparable from centuries of expectation, duty, and scrutiny. Every joke now carried dual meaning: entertainment for the audience and a delicate maneuver in a psychological game being played on the stage itself. And then came the micro-escalation, a brief moment of eye contact, a subtle inflection, a gesture that, on the surface, might seem inconsequential. To the audience, it was barely noticeable, perhaps even invisible. But to Harry, it was an unmistakable signal. The line had been crossed. And the tension, which had been simmering under the surface, began to rise, an invisible storm threatening to break. Here's the fascinating part. Despite the pressure, Harry's response was not overtly confrontational. He did not raise his voice. He did not storm the stage. He did not make a public scene. Instead, his reaction was a careful calibration of micro-expressions, posture adjustments, and controlled gestures, a subtle, yet undeniable assertion of presence and authority. It was the kind of response that communicates volumes without a single word being spoken. Hasan, perceptive as he is, noticed the shift. The comedian's instinct is to maintain rhythm, to keep the audience engaged, to adapt to every change in energy. Yet, even with his skills, the interaction had moved into uncharted territory. The subtle psychological dance between the two men had become the focal point of the room, even if the audience was unaware. Every joke, every pause, every punchline now carried additional weight, layered with tension and anticipation. And the audience? They remained blissfully oblivious. They laughed, clapped, and followed the rhythm of Hasan's performance, interpreting everything as part of the show. What they did not realize was that they were witnessing a masterclass in nonverbal communication, a delicate negotiation of ego, identity, and respect. They saw entertainment. Harry and Hasan were engaged in a silent dialogue that would leave lasting impressions on both men and shape narratives that would extend far beyond the studio. The tension reached a new peak when Hasan, unknowingly or perhaps subtly, tested the boundaries further. Another joke, a clever quip about fame and recognition, brushed again against the unspoken lines Harry held sacred. And in that moment, a shift occurred. Harry's posture became slightly more rigid, his gaze sharper, his presence undeniable. Hasan, sensing the undercurrent, adjusted his delivery, weaving tension into humor, improvisation into performance. What had been a standard comedy segment had transformed into a complex interplay of identity, pride, and social negotiation. This is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Harry's restraint, the careful management of expression, posture, and microgesture, is a study in the human response to perceived disrespect under pressure. He could have erupted. He could have created a scene that dominated media coverage instantly. But instead, he chose subtlety, control, and the silent assertion of self. And that choice, while invisible to most of the audience, amplified the intensity of the interaction in ways that would become more apparent in the aftermath. And here lies the ironic twist. The more subtle Harry's reaction, the more complicated the dynamic became for Hasan. Every adjustment, every delivery choice, now carried unspoken consequences. The comedian had to navigate a delicate balance between humor and acknowledgement, between performance and unintentional provocation. And every single interaction, every pause, every gesture became a test of instinct, timing, and perception, a real-time psychological negotiation that few outside the studio could even comprehend. Then came the moment that would define the night. A fleeting interaction, so small it could have been missed, yet loaded with significance. A glance, a pause, a tilt of the head, enough to convey authority, expectation, and a challenge without a single word being spoken. Hasan registered it, adapted in real time, and incorporated the tension into the performance. The audience, oblivious to the underlying drama, continued to respond with laughter and applause. Yet beneath the surface, the stakes had been irrevocably raised. And just as the room seemed to hold its breath, the night introduced another variable, a subtle escalation, an unpredictable moment that neither Harry nor Hasan could fully anticipate. That moment would push the encounter beyond humor and protocol, transforming it into an emotionally charged interaction that revealed the fragile interplay between identity, respect, and human ego. Because what came next would not only heighten the tension, it would set off a chain reaction that no one in the studio, and few outside it, could have foreseen. What happens when subtle tension transforms into a palpable force that fills an entire room? That night, in Hasan Minhaj's studio, the air itself seemed to vibrate with unspoken conflict. Every glance, every pause, every barely perceptible shift in posture carried meaning far beyond what the audience could see. Laughter rang out around them, but for Harry, every chuckle was a reminder of the friction between expectation and reality, a friction that had been simmering quietly since the moment he walked through the studio doors. To understand the magnitude of this moment, you have to consider Harry's life as a study in public perception and control. From the time he was a child, his every move, expression, and decision was scrutinized, dissected, and magnified. This constant observation teaches you one crucial thing. Microgestures matter. Every glance communicates. Every posture conveys. Every pause can be interpreted as either deference or defiance. And in a scenario like this, a single omission, the failure to say "Your Highness," is not just a social oversight. It is a challenge to identity, a subtle threat to the self-image meticulously constructed over a lifetime under public scrutiny. Hasan, for his part, was in his element, performing, improvising, entertaining. But the dynamics had shifted. What had started as routine comedy had morphed into a delicate psychological dance. Hasan's skill at reading audiences was being tested against an entirely new dimension, one human being's centuries-deep conditioning versus another human being's instinctive improvisation. Each joke, each pause, each expression was a move in a game that neither man could entirely predict. Then came the subtle escalation. Hasan, noting a slight stiffening in Harry's posture, instinctively adjusted his rhythm, weaving tension into the performance. The audience, unaware of the underlying narrative, laughed at the quip, completely missing the silent conversation unfolding across the stage. Harry, however, perceived every nuance. The timing of Hasan's words, the intonation, the layered subtext. And in that perception, the tension intensified. What's fascinating here is the psychology of restraint. Harry had two choices: react publicly, risk a scene, and allow every camera, every microphone, every social media platform to dissect him, or respond subtly, with gestures, glances, and measured presence. He chose the latter, a decision that amplified the unspoken drama. His silence, his micro-expressions, became a language unto themselves. A controlled, potent form of communication that conveyed authority, displeasure, and expectation without uttering a single word. And Hasan, ever the performer, sensed the shift. He had to recalibrate on the fly. His timing, his phrasing, his cadence, all had to be adapted in real time. What was intended as a routine joke became a high-stakes negotiation. Humor, usually a tool for entertainment, now served as a bridge between worlds. The ceremonial, tradition-steeped realm Harry represented, and the irreverent, improvisational universe Hasan occupied. Every line had layered meaning, and every pause carried weight. It's worth pausing to consider the audience's role in this scenario. To them, it was an ordinary comedy show, a series of clever observations and punchlines. But beneath the surface, the room was a laboratory of human behavior. Two men, each trained in their own way to navigate public perception, were engaged in a silent confrontation. One was constrained by centuries of expectation, the other by instinctive performance. And neither could predict precisely how the other would respond. The audience laughed, but they were witnessing a psychological duel that would leave lasting impressions far beyond the studio walls. The subtle escalation reached a pivotal point when Hasan made a clever remark about fame, recognition, and the absurdities of public life. To the audience, it was just another joke. But to Harry, it hit closer to home, a nuanced provocation, a reminder of everything he had endured in the public eye. His reaction, restrained but unmistakable, communicated awareness and displeasure. A tightening of the jaw, a faint shift in posture, a gaze that lingered. These microbehaviors were powerful. They conveyed both authority and expectation, signaling that boundaries had been tested. Hasan, quick to respond, incorporated the tension into his performance. His improvisational skill allowed him to maintain rhythm while subtly acknowledging the undercurrent of conflict. What had been routine comedy transformed into a dynamic interaction layered with social negotiation, psychological signaling, and the delicate balance of ego and identity. The interplay between them became almost magnetic, invisible yet intensely felt by anyone perceptive enough to notice. But here's the twist. Even as Hasan adapted, the tension continued to build. Harry's restraint, his careful calibration, made the unspoken conflict more potent. The more subtle his reactions, the more challenging they became for Hasan. Every line, every joke, every pause now required nuanced interpretation, creating a feedback loop that intensified the psychological stakes. It was no longer merely a performance. It was a test of instinct, adaptability, and human perception under pressure. And then, just as the tension seemed at its peak, an unexpected moment occurred. A fleeting expression, a subtle inflection, a brief gesture. That changed everything. It was almost imperceptible, yet its impact was profound. That single moment shifted the dynamic, elevating the encounter from subtle psychological negotiation to a confrontation that was emotionally charged, historically symbolic, and deeply human. Because what happened next would not only escalate the evening's tension, it would ignite a series of reactions and consequences that neither man nor the audience could have foreseen. It would force both Harry and Hasan to confront boundaries, pride, and identity in ways that went far beyond the stage, leaving ripples that extended into the media, social discourse, and public imagination. And that ripple, the unforeseen consequence of one subtle interaction, was about to change everything. What if a single misstep, or a single deliberate choice, could turn a controlled evening into a psychological battlefield? That night in Hasan Minhaj's studio, that's exactly what was happening. The tension between Prince Harry and Hasan, invisible to most of the audience, had escalated beyond subtle cues and micro-expressions. Every gesture, every pause, every glance was now charged with meaning, carrying centuries of expectation colliding with modern irreverence. And while the crowd laughed at the jokes, oblivious to the storm beneath the surface, the room had become a stage for a silent, high-stakes confrontation. Consider the psychology at play. Harry had spent decades living under scrutiny, every movement dissected, every emotion analyzed. He was acutely aware of how he was perceived, how even minor reactions could be magnified into headlines or misinterpreted as arrogance, weakness, or anger. And yet, despite all of that, a simple omission, the lack of the title, Your Highness, had triggered a profound reaction. It was not merely about ego, it was about identity, history, and validation. For someone whose very life had been shaped by centuries of tradition and public expectation, a missing word could carry immense emotional weight. Hasan, for his part, continued performing at full intensity. His routine was flawless, his timing precise, his humor sharp. But even he could feel the shift in energy. There was something different about this interaction, something that demanded heightened awareness. He noticed Harry's subtle movements, a slight tightening of the jaw, a controlled shift in posture, a gaze that lingered just a fraction too long. Each of these microsignals was a communication of displeasure, authority, and silent assertion. Hasan, quick and perceptive, adjusted his performance accordingly, weaving tension into humor without breaking the rhythm of the show. And then came the pivotal moment, a line, delivered with trademark wit, that crossed an invisible boundary. To the audience, it was just another clever joke. To Harry, it was a provocation, a subtle challenge that tested his composure, his patience, and his control. His reaction, measured and restrained, was powerful in its subtlety. A tightening of the lips, a deliberate pause before shifting his gaze, a micro-expression that spoke volumes without words. These were the tools of a man trained to navigate centuries of protocol, yet faced with a situation that no training could fully prepare him for. What's remarkable is how this interaction highlighted the collision of two worlds. Harry's reality is governed by centuries of tradition, social hierarchy, and codified respect. Hassan's world thrives on irreverence, improvisation, and social critique. When these two universes meet, friction is inevitable, and the friction on that stage was palpable. Every joke became more than entertainment. It became a move in an unspoken psychological chess game. Every reaction, no matter how subtle, had consequences. The audience, still unaware, continued to laugh. Their perception was shaped entirely by the visible performance, the jokes, the timing, the humor. What they could not perceive was the silent negotiation of power, the psychological signaling, and the intricate dance of authority and respect occurring just feet away. For Harry, every moment was a test, a choice between restraint and reaction, diplomacy and assertion, composure and instinct. And his decision to maintain control, to communicate without words, only amplified the tension, creating a silent